I do not want to be a burden. That is the note I left on my son's kitchen desk at 4 in the morning. 6 weeks after hip surgery, right after his wife stood over me on the staircase and called me exhausting while my own son asked me to apologize to her. Hours later, my card was declined at a small pharmacy in another city, and when I finally checked my account, $85,000 that I had saved over 15 years of my life was simply gone. This is the story of how that morning nearly broke me, and how it also turned into the moment I finally saw my family with completely clear eyes. My name is Grant Holloway, and at 72 years old, I thought I understood my own son better than anyone on earth. I raised him alone for the last 4 years, ever since my wife Diane passed away, and I told myself that the quiet distance growing between us was just what happens when children become adults with their own busy lives. 6 weeks before that terrible morning, I had gone in for hip replacement surgery, and because I lived alone, my son Bradley insisted I recover at his house in a quiet suburb outside Columbus. I agreed gratefully, never imagining that agreement would cost me nearly everything I owned. Bradley and his wife Kayla gave me the small guest room upstairs, a single window, a narrow bed, the kind of space you offer someone when you are not quite sure how long they intend to stay. I told myself I was grateful anyway. I had raised Bradley through Little League games and shaky geometry homework, sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours the night their son Tyler was born, and quietly paid for more of his mistakes over the years than I ever told a living soul. A father does not keep score, or at least I never thought I did, until the night everything I had given him got repaid with a single ugly word. It happened at 3 in the morning, 3 weeks after my surgery, when the deep grinding pain in my hip pulled me out of sleep the way it did most nights. My pain medication was downstairs on the kitchen counter, and rather than wake anyone, I gripped the banister and started down 14 creaking wooden stairs, one careful step at a time. I was on step 7 when the hallway light snapped on above me, and Kayla stood at the top of the landing with her arms already crossing over her chest, looking at me the way you look at a problem that refuses to fix itself. "You are doing it again," she said, her voice low but sharp, worn thin from what sounded like weeks of quiet resentment finally breaking loose. "Every single night, Grant, the creaking, the shuffling. Do you have any idea what it is like trying to sleep through that?" I told her I only needed my medicine, that it was downstairs, and she came down 2 more steps, telling me this was the 4th time that week, that she had to be up early, that we could not keep doing this. I apologized for the floor, and she said it was not the floor at all, it was me, that I was everywhere in her house, and that I had no idea how exhausting I was to have around. That word landed somewhere deep in my chest. I stood at the bottom of the stairs at 72 years old, 3 weeks removed from surgery I never really wanted, and listened to my daughter-in-law call me exhausting. That is when Bradley's bedroom door opened, and he stepped into the hallway in a gray shirt and sweatpants, looking from his wife to me and back again like a man calculating exactly how much trouble he was standing in. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck, the way he used to as a teenager right before saying something he already knew I would not like, and he told me I needed to be more careful, that Kayla needed her sleep, that we both did. I asked him plainly if he wanted me to apologize, and the silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "It would go a long way," he finally said quietly, and I understood in that instant exactly where I stood in my own son's house. I told him I was sorry, and I meant it, though not to the person he expected. I got my medication from the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and climbed those 14 stairs back to the guest room without looking behind me once. I sat on the edge of that narrow bed a long time that night, turning a small notebook over in my hands, thinking about my late wife Diane and how she used to say I loved that boy too much to ever look straight at him. By morning I had already made my decision, though it did not arrive with any drama at all, only a quiet certainty that settled into my bones somewhere around 3:30 that morning. I dressed carefully in the blue button-down Diane had given me years earlier, packed my small suitcase with the same neat corners she had taught me, and wrote a single sentence on a notepad from the kitchen desk. "I do not want to be a burden." I left it where it would be found, then carried my bag downstairs to find Bradley already awake, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. His eyes went straight to the suitcase, and his face moved through surprise, before settling into something closer to inconvenience than concern. He told me I could not just leave, that I was still recovering, that I did not even have anyone waiting for me back in my old hometown. I told him I knew exactly where I was going. When he reached out and rested his hand on the handle of my suitcase, I simply asked him to move it, and for one brief second I saw the uncertain boy I used to know flicker behind his eyes before it disappeared completely. Kayla appeared in the doorway and offered a half-hearted "you do not have to leave," and I told her, not unkindly, that I thought we both knew otherwise. My grandson Tyler came down the stairs just as the cab arrived, 14 years old, backpack slung over one shoulder, hair still damp from the shower. He stopped cold when he saw the suitcase by the door, and his voice cracked slightly when he asked if everything was okay. Not entirely, I told him, but it will be. He did not hug me, he was never much of a hugger, but he stood close enough that I could have touched his shoulder if I wanted to. And he said one quiet thing before heading out to catch his bus. "Come back." Okay. That single sentence carried me through the entire 4-hour drive that followed. I checked into a small motel off a quiet avenue in my old hometown that evening, the kind of place with a patterned bedspread that hides its own wear and a heater that clicks when it first comes on. I needed my afternoon dose of medication, so I walked 3 blocks to a small old-fashioned pharmacy, and when I slid my debit card through the reader, the machine beeped once and flashed a single word across the screen: declined. I asked the young cashier to try again, and when the same result appeared, I stepped away and opened my banking app with hands that I will admit were not entirely steady. The balance read $23.14. My eyes went straight to the transaction history, and my stomach dropped straight through the pharmacy floor. 8 separate transfers over 6 weeks, each between $8,000 and $15,000, every single one initiated during the exact window I had been in the hospital, and then flat on my back in that guest room. $85,000, 15 years of careful saving, my grandson's future college fund, all of it gone in a matter of weeks, while I trusted the son I raised to look after me. A voice behind me broke through the fog. "Grant Holloway, is that you?" I turned to find Susan Kessler, a retired nurse who had once cared for my wife Diane during the final 11 days of her life at the hospital. She had held Diane's hand through the worst of it and brought me coffee at 2 in the morning without ever being asked. She read the situation on my face instantly, took the prescription bag from my trembling hands, and insisted on paying for it herself before walking me 2 doors down to a small coffee shop where she told me to sit and explain everything from the beginning. I told her about the surgery, the guest room, the staircase, Kayla's words, the note I left, and finally the empty account. She listened without interrupting, then asked one question that changed the entire shape of what I thought had happened to me. "How long has Bradley been managing your finances?" I told her he was never supposed to be managing them at all, only that the hospital had me sign a power of attorney before surgery, naming him because he was the only family nearby, and that I never thought to revoke it once I recovered. Susan told me gently that meant he still had full legal access to every account I owned. She then told me about an old friend named Arthur, a widower whose own son had stepped in to help manage his finances after a small stroke, only to disappear to Florida 6 months later with $60,000 of his father's savings gone. When she mentioned the son's name, Ethan Marsh, something cold clicked into place in my memory. Months earlier, Bradley had mentioned a man named Ethan Marsh, describing him as a client he was helping with some kind of account restructuring. Susan looked at me and said plainly, "They were not strangers, Grant, your son learned this from somewhere." She told me something worse still, something she had carried silently for years out of uncertainty. During the final week of Diane's life, while I had stepped out to speak with her doctor, she walked into the hospital room and heard Bradley on the phone asking what the current assessed value on my house was, while his own mother lay dying in the bed beside him. That single detail broke something open in my chest that I had kept sealed for 4 years, and I sat there in that small coffee shop feeling grief and rage arrive together for the very first time. Susan connected me with a lawyer named Gregory Lane, whose small office sat above a quiet street lined with old brick buildings. I told him everything: the power of attorney, the transfers, the $85,000, and he listened with the careful patience of a man who had heard every version of betrayal before. Then he turned his monitor toward me and delivered news that stole the air from my lungs completely. 3 days before my surgery, Bradley had filed a legal petition asking a judge to grant him full guardianship over my person and my finances, claiming I showed early signs of cognitive decline. Gregory explained that unlike the power of attorney I had willingly signed, a guardianship is imposed by a court, and it strips a person of the legal right to make their own decisions entirely. The petition cited my age, a note from an unfamiliar physician suggesting possible memory impairment, and supposed incidents of mismanaged household expenses that had simply never happened. Worse still, property records showed that a licensed appraiser had assessed my house 5 months before my surgery, long before I ever needed one. My son had not found an opportunity in my illness, he had built one in advance. I called my old business partner Bruce Callahan that same afternoon, a man I had spent 30 years working alongside on construction projects across 2 states. He drove in within hours, and together with Gregory we confirmed something crucial, that I still had assets Bradley knew absolutely nothing about. Years earlier, Bruce and I had quietly built a limited liability company holding passive investments worth over $300,000, registered under initials with no public link to my name, along with a separate commercial real estate stake worth another $180,000. Bradley believed my entire financial life was a house and an empty savings account, and I decided we would let him keep believing exactly that. Gregory pulled one more record before we left his office that day, a property filing connected to an old colleague of mine named Gary Nolan, submitted the very same week I went into surgery. I had once defended Gary in a bitter contract dispute years earlier and never asked for anything in return. Yet here he was quietly listed as a potential buyer for my own house. It stung in a way that had nothing to do with money, the particular ache of loyalty repaid with betrayal by someone I never expected it from. That night in my motel room I discovered something that turned my stomach cold in an entirely new way. A pill bottle from my medication supply had a slightly crooked label in my own handwriting, sitting over the faint ghost outline of another label that had clearly been removed. Inside were round pale yellow tablets, not the white oval anti-inflammatory I had taken every day for weeks. When I described them to Susan over the phone, her voice went careful and precise. That is a sedative, Grant, sometimes prescribed to manage agitation in patients believed to be experiencing cognitive decline. My own son had drugged me to manufacture the very symptoms he needed for his court petition. I returned to Bradley's house 2 weeks later dressed as though nothing had changed, carrying inside me an entirely different man than the one who had left in a cab that morning. I let him believe I had simply run out of places to go. While I stayed, I quietly gathered proof. Security sensors installed with my grandson's cheerful help around the house, recorded late-night phone calls where Bradley discussed moving forward with a signature before any court hearing could stop him, and a growing understanding that a formal family meeting had already been scheduled for the 12th of December, complete with a hired psychiatrist instructed to document impairment, whether it existed or not. My daughter-in-law Kayla came to me one evening with a folder of documents she had kept hidden for months, along with an honest confession that she had known about the entire scheme and stayed silent out of fear for her own family. She handed over a draft sale agreement listing my house at nearly $60,000 below its actual value, along with text messages confirming the psychiatrist's role in the plan. My neighbor Nancy Winslow contributed photographs she had taken months earlier of strange men measuring my house while I lay recovering in the hospital, evidence she had saved simply because something about it had felt wrong at the time. On the morning of December 12th, the living room filled with relatives, the hired psychiatrist, Gary Nolan, and my lawyer Gregory Lane, whom Bradley had never invited, and whose presence drained the color from his face the instant he arrived. Bradley opened with a rehearsed speech about aging parents and responsible oversight, then asked the psychiatrist to begin a standard cognitive evaluation. I answered every single question clearly and without hesitation, and by the 7th question the doctor closed his folder and quietly admitted he had exactly what he needed, a result that would never support the petition Bradley had built his entire plan around. I stood and told the room everything. The guardianship filed weeks before my surgery, the $85,000 taken while I lay unconscious, the sedative swapped into my medication to manufacture false symptoms. Gregory laid out every document across the coffee table while Gary Nolan rose in fury, accusing Bradley of lying to him about my consent before storming out the front door. Then Kayla stood, shaking but resolute, and told the room she had known for months and stayed silent out of fear, and that she would no longer be quiet about any of it. My grandson Tyler stood last, spine straight, and asked his father one simple question that silenced the entire room completely. "Dad, do you want me to treat you the way you treated Grandpa when you get old?" Bradley could not answer him. He simply could not. The doorbell rang moments later, and a process server handed him legal papers confirming a restraining order and a formal civil filing demanding full restitution. I told him quietly, away from the others, that I was not pursuing criminal charges, that I wanted him to repay what he took and face the court, but that I was not trying to destroy him. That decision I made entirely for Tyler. I moved back into my own home before Christmas. The rose bush Diane planted decades ago still dormant by the front steps, waiting patiently for spring the way it always had. Bruce came by with a bottle of scotch he had been saving for an occasion significant enough to deserve it, and we sat together at my kitchen table discussing what came next. I told him I planned to revise my will completely, placing everything into a trust for Tyler and creating a foundation in Diane and my names, one dedicated to providing free legal help for elderly people facing exactly what I had just survived. Kayla and Bradley separated not long after that difficult morning, and Tyler now splits his time between them, while learning engineering drawings at my kitchen table on weekends, asking real questions with the same focused curiosity Diane always loved in him. One evening I watched Bradley's car slow at the curb outside my house, engine running for several long minutes before he finally drove away without ever stepping out. I did not know what he was carrying inside that car, guilt or grief or something better trying to grow, and for the first time in over 40 years, I understood that it was no longer mine to carry for him. People sometimes ask me if any of it was worth the cost, the lawyers, the sleepless nights, the months of holding everything close to my chest while sleeping down the hall from the man who betrayed me. My answer is always the same. It was never about being worth it. It was about being right. I waited far too long to ask hard questions of the people I trusted most, and I confused love with permission for far too many years, a mistake that nearly cost me everything I had built across an entire lifetime. If there is one thing I would ask anyone listening to take from my story, it is simply this. Do not wait until your own account is empty before you finally learn to look closely at the people closest to you.